Morgan, so I am a DC local. I grew up in Maryland and then moved down to North Carolina for college. Went to Chapel Hill, and at Chapel Hill entered into the School of Journalism, where I focused primarily in front end development as it pertained to interactive and journalistic storytelling. Came straight out of college and went to Viget as a front end development intern. And that's really where I first got a sense for best practices around accessibility and how it should be shaping work. If I reflect back on my time in college, we were really focused on getting a product up quickly, getting a story out quickly. And there really wasn't too much focus on equal access, equitable access, really even down to some of the basic levels that I really didn't get to start seeing until I had my code reviewed by the full-time staff at Viget, which was a humbling experience, but also greatly educational. That's where I really started to learn some of the techniques that developers use to make the code side of things accessible. Spoiler alert, I'm no longer a front-end developer. I am now a project manager. And I transitioned out of that position in the late summer of 2018, and but I took the front end skills with me, and have really ever since been focusing on ways to support teams, energize teams in designing and developing products that are reasonably accessible. I think it's important to note there, like I'll be talking about my experience in sort of leading teams and supporting teams in building and designing accessible products. But I do this work as someone who is, I'm non-disabled. And I think it's important to recognize as we go through this conversation, some of the ways that operating in a space advocating for a community of people that is incredibly diverse, has incredibly diverse needs and abilities, it takes a certain amount of self-awareness around the possibility for ableist bias to enter into the work. So I'm curious to dig into some of those areas of the work as a non-disabled person, doing accessibility work and centering accessibility in digital creation.
Yeah, Peyton, I would actually love to kind of dig into that before we get into some of the kind of nuts and bolts work. But yeah, I think that I'd love to kind of hear you talk a little bit about how you have worked on, I think, making sure that those biases don't enter into your work. How do you kind of check yourself a little bit throughout the life cycle of a project, or just as you are learning about accessibility? Are there some kind of some things that we can take back with us and kind of think through when we are trying to be more involved in accessibility?
Yeah, I'd say the very first thing as you start to learn more about the current state of accessibility best practices in the industry is that there is a robust set of standards, blog posts, documentation, organizations that are providing really great training that we can lean on best practices to fill in the gaps where we can't make assumptions about how a user might intend to experience something, or how an assistive technology might impact a user's experience with a product. So you don't need to know it all. You don't need to have to be able to experience it all directly to follow the internationally recognized standards, which in the accessibility world right now, what we have is WCAG. That's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's the 2.1 version currently. And that comes from W3C, the international sort of governing body of the web. And it's a really robust set of guidelines that break down into success criteria that you can sort of binary check off yes or no. Does my product meet this certain standard? There is some subjectivity to some of those. So I won't say that accessibility could ever come down to a checklist. But I think one of the best ways to combat bias in doing accessibility work is leaning in on the standards that folks have created to give us a level playing field internationally.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things I think we were kind of talking about a few days ago was how the interesting thing about this conversation is that generally, I think that we're all used to thinking about accessibility kind of through the lens of, if you're an engineer or you're a designer. And I think that it's really, I think that what I've appreciated about you is that you have kind of thought so much about, well, okay, where is kind of my perspective coming from, and how can I then filter this information through, okay, well, like, where can I fit into this? And I feel like that is something that a lot of us are kind of struggling with. Is I went through that initial kind of thinking through of, well, I'm not a designer, I'm not an engineer, so can I actually contribute in a meaningful way to accessibility as a brand strategist, as a content person? And I'd kind of love to hear your thoughts on, what would you say to folks who are kind of hesitating, like, do I belong here? Should I be doing this? Yeah.
Yeah, I would first back up. I recognize we didn't really start by defining accessibility itself. Accessibility can mean a whole lot of things. And I think it's really closely tied to the concept of equity as digital professionals creating digital products that remove barriers versus creating new ones. But in the specific context, we're talking about accessibility through the lens of, the set of practices, processes, and techniques that we use to design and build digital products that people of all abilities can use. I say people of all abilities, yes, that's true, but in the specific context of talking about accessibility and some of the very specific techniques that we're using, we're really focusing on users of assistive technology, users with disabilities, and there are certain steps that we need to do to design, to code in ways that are compatible with the user's expectations. So just want to set that that's specifically what we're talking about. We could talk about accessibility in the lens of recognizing that not every person has access to 4G or 5G if you're lucky enough. Slow broadband connections are a form of access and something that we need to consider along the way. But specifically here, we're talking about users with disabilities. I would say that if you're on this call, if you touch a computer in your daily work, if you work with other humans, accessibility is part of your work in some way. I would say two things, at least if I'm looking at you in terms of being a copywriter or brand strategist. Language is one of the cruxes of, like, it's the core of the internet is language in one way or another. And there are plenty of ways that we can lean on best practices. Even just Googling like how to write accessible copy would be a great starting place to say, like, hey, let's read what some folks have written about making sure that I'm writing copy in a way that is going to be accessible to the broadest swath of users. In the WCAG standards, in the strictest level of conformance with those standards, which is level AAA, there's A, AA, AAA. There's actually a requirement to specifically avoid jargon, avoid unnecessarily complex vocabulary. We're thinking about users with cognitive disabilities, perhaps reading challenges. Things like providing a summary on a page that I think the text is like a lower secondary grade level could read. So if you're going to that top level of accessibility for your digital product, you're providing a page full of content, and then you're providing a summary that someone at a lower secondary level could glean meaningful content from. So that's just a really specific example. I think as a starting point, if you're on this call and you work with a computer, even just starting with a Google of like my role plus accessibility and seeing the articles that come up can be a great starting point. Catherine just put in there, it's a great point. When we talk about alt text, alternative text, that's text that we provide in place of images. Typically, we're thinking about screen reader users who may not see or see well, so that they can get the content of graphic images on a page. It also displays in some browsers when an image fails to load. So you're thinking about access from a bunch of different perspectives here. And yes, Catherine, you're exactly right. Alt text needs strong writers as well.
Yeah, I love that. And those are all, I think, so I love those tips. They are just kind of so practical. And it's so, I think that one thing that Peyton, I feel like you've taught me a lot through this is really just that kind of grounding myself in the context that I am in. Where am I kind of operating? And then how can I bring that lens to kind of whatever I'm doing, rather than kind of thinking about it in terms of, well, can't do those things. I can't do those things. It's like, well, wait, what can you do?
Definitely. And maybe let's save it for a little bit later in the conversation, but I'm happy to, we didn't intend for this conversation to really be like a 101 to accessibility, because there are some really great things that, set you up with a small toolkit to get yourself started in being an advocate for accessibility. So maybe we'll take a little bit of time to chat through that toward the end, after some of the higher level, like team project leadership type things.
Yes, and I can also, I may sync up with you after this, Peyton, just get some of those kind of resources if folks are looking for them, and I can send them out in an email afterwards. But yes, I would love to kind of dive into talking about how this kind of came to life on a project that you were recently on, Peyton, which was the redesign of HRC.org, HRC, the Human Rights Campaign. I thought that just, you had some really awesome learnings that you took from that on kind of how project managers can really empower that process. So I'd love to hear you talk about that, but I'd also love if you could just start by giving us a little bit of context around what that project was about. And sorry about that, I'm just gonna, there we go. Just, yeah, give us a little bit of context what that project was about. What were some of the challenges, what you were trying to solve for there?
Yeah, so the Human Rights Campaign is the nation's largest LGBTQ plus civil rights organization, based out of DC. And they came to Viget a couple years ago to engage in a redesign of HRC.org, their sort of flagship web property. We knew going into that accessibility was going to be a priority. It should be for any organization, and we can get into why that's the case. For a host of reasons, but of course, you're a civil rights organization, you're focused on equity at your core. HRC really prioritized from the start, ensuring that this site met a reasonable standard of accessibility and that their teams were prepared to sort of carry that on into the future. So the first thing was, I got lucky in that at Viget, we have a really strong sort of ethos around accessibility across project teams, and had a great team alongside the redesign throughout, folks who were asking the questions and answering the questions around everything from design reviews really early on, and working together with the lead designer on the project, Mindy Wagner from Viget, being able to have conversations back and forth in design reviews and saying, like, even if I don't have something specific in mind, let's take a look at this page through the lens of accessibility. Let's think through how the user is going to tab through this page with their keyboard, or hey, let's take a look at the contrast between that background and foreground color, because it looks like they might be a little too close for comfort. So I would say, as a project manager, just to back up into like me specifically, the opportunity as someone, a project manager, an account manager, an account executive, sort of depending on where you fall in the industry, one of the opportunities that you have as someone who's going to be touching the entire life cycle of a project is being able to do exactly that, to be the accessibility advocate, or one of the accessibility advocates, luckily in our case, asking the right questions throughout. So you don't need to have the answers. You don't need to know exactly how a front-end developer is going to code up a certain component in order to make it meet a certain standard. You should be thinking about asking the right questions around, have we thought about this through the lens of someone with a visual disability who may not see or see well? Have we thought about someone who may, animation is really hot in the industry right now. Have we thought about this animation through the lens of someone with a vestibular disorder who may be really sensitive to motion on the screen? And that's not to say that conversation in a design review sounds like, let me discredit your incredible animation work, let's shut this down. It's thinking, okay, what are all the alternatives that we're going to provide? Are we going to allow them, a user, to pause that manually themselves? Are we going to respect a setting that they have toggled on their computer? So, across Mac and Windows, users are able to set a setting called prefer reduce motion, and we can actually write CSS to respect that. So in many cases, we set up a media query and check for that setting. If it's turned on, the user saying, please reduce the motion as much as you can, because I want to be able to use this without feeling sick. And we respect that by maybe showing them a static graphic instead of that same graphic looping in onto the screen, or something like that.
Yeah, I just love that. I think that you've added such an important nuance to that idea of being an advocate, because it is also the kind of, it's asking the right questions and it's being able to be the person who can bring those questions into a meeting, but it's also, I think you bring solutions as well. Like, well, like, here are some options. This is not saying that we can't do this. It's just, how can we actually think about how to make this better, and bringing forward some of those options, I think is something that I think is so important. And I feel like if I had approached that, I probably would have been just kind of trying to watchdog a little bit, like, oh, well, we can't do that and we can't do that. And I think that that's that next step a little bit that you are so good at taking, I think.
Yeah, it's, well, yes and no. I mean, we all fall into traps. I think folks who might identify as accessibility advocates or professionals, it's really easy, especially, I'm pretty early on in my career and even in my accessibility journey. It's really easy to start thinking about things in really binary, or as like, it can't be this way, it has to be X way. It's really tempting to fall into that because it simplifies some of the decision making. But the decision making on projects when you're thinking about accessibility is a lot more nuanced than that. So I think the gap between, maybe if you're on this lunch and this is the first conversation that you really had that really focused centered entirely around accessibility, the gap from there to being able to then provide a few options to remedy an issue that you're seeing, that's gaining that knowledge looks like, one, experiencing across project teams and leaning on internal, finding internal experts at your organization if they do exist, to ask questions, to say, hey, can I grab 30 minutes so you can take a look at this design, even if right now there's not a structure in place at work for that sort of collaboration, just going out of the way to create it. And then also seeking out the educational resources there to really level up into a level of expertise or quasi-expertise, to be able to provide those solutions. So things like DQ University, that's DEQUE. DQ is a accessibility consultancy based out of Northern Virginia, and they provide online courses. That's a really great resource. Honestly, if you just on YouTube search accessibility basics or accessibility 101, there's some really great resources. Google Devs, so gosh, there's a man, something Dodson, I can't remember his name at this time, but he has created a really great video series around accessibility. So I think filling the gap to the point where you can provide options to a team as they decide how to move forward in a way that respects the original intent. That's a gap of education, and it's a gap that I'm still filling.
Yeah, well, and this may kind of betray my own lack of knowledge, deep knowledge when it comes to project management. But I think that one thing that's interesting is that, when I'm on a project and if I'm in kind of a writer role, I have usually a partner to kind of bounce stuff off of. I'm working with a designer or an art director, UX designer. And so there is kind of this failsafe mechanism that I feel like I sort of have built in for me. And I think that it's interesting when I think about project managers, and y'all are often working as the sole project manager on a project. And it's been interesting then to hear you talk about how you have kind of built a structure for yourself that makes sure that you have that support, you have that kind of expertise that you're able to access. Was that something you kind of had to learn, oh shoot, I need this? Or was that something that you just kind of, yeah, how did that go?
Well, I would say that yes, some of the structure has been built in my time on project teams at Viget over the last few years, but also a lot of it was already in place and a lot of expertise was already in place. So one is just identifying the internal experts, like I said, and leaning on them, either setting up coffee chats or, like I said, specific reviews of specific materials. I would also say that as I started, say a year or two ago, as I started, filing in accessibility bug tickets after doing a sort of a robust set of quality assurance testing focusing on accessibility, it becomes immediately apparent that folks have opinions about how things should be implemented and how one change that you're seeing through the specific lens of accessibility in this one place in an app might impact 17 other places through a bunch of other lenses. So I think one of the structures is playing into those channels of feedback that may or may not already exist in your work. So, I'm not often participating directly in code review that the engineering team here at Viget engages with together, but in accessibility QA, I try to be involved in that process and do some of the back and forth. And sometimes, yeah, it's like, okay, yep, I was wrong. I'm glad I flagged it, but I'm glad we talked about it as a group. And then sometimes it's like, no, I feel really confident about this one being something that will increase access for users, and I'm going to advocate for it. Either work together with another project manager or myself to prioritize it in the queue of fixes. So I think it's finding the right people to get in front of, and then leaning on existing structures for review and feedback. I think it's really important not to do accessibility work by yourself, because, like I said, that's where that bias really can creep in when you think that you have the inherent binary right or true solution, because it's rarely the case.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I do have more questions about HRC, but I wanted to kind of go back to one thing that you said. I do think is that we don't really have this problem at Viget of having one person on the team that may not be as dialed in, it may not be quite as interested in thinking about accessibility, may not want to be part of those conversations. I don't think that's something you have encountered maybe so far. And yet I'm wondering, how do we kind of approach those conversations? Are there things that you as a project manager would think about when you're trying to navigate that, bring somebody into that without just telling them, no, you can't do that, or yes, you can do that?
Yeah, I mean, I would first caveat it with I would hope the universal experience is that the grain of salt is that it's less about someone being less focused on accessibility, but someone being really focused on the sort of crux of their role on a project, or perhaps they're really dialed in, focusing on a specific feature for this week or two, and you've asked them about something, on the complete opposite side of the app, it's taking them out of their context, that sort of thing. I think one of the best things that you can do, as you get more familiar with the WCAG standards, which are, that sort of level setting body of guidelines that you can use, is making sure that when you're flagging issues or preempting issues, that you're backing it up with links out to the spec or links out to articles from respected peers who have recommended that X pathway makes sense. There are a lot of folks who have created content in the accessibility space that is based on user research. Like, Marcy Sutton is a really great leader in the accessibility space. I think she's now freelance, but just there's a lot of really great writing around accessibility, and some of that writing is really backed up by surveys, by user interviews, by moderated user testing. So I think it's important to lean on the documentation, the guidelines, the blog posts that you can find to help say, okay, not only am I dictating X, Y, or Z thing needs to work in this way, here's some additional materials that you can take a look at to create your own opinion and recommendation about it. So I think that's important. It's just equipping folks with the resources that they need to either accept or push back on your recommendation.
I love that. Yeah, that's awesome advice. And I also see we have some great questions coming into chat. We will definitely save some time because these are awesome questions. So we'll definitely save some time at the end to get Peyton to weigh in on these. So keep on putting them in the chat because this is great. But I did want to just go back quickly to HRC. And I think that, Peyton, you mentioned something about how project managers are so integral to thinking about the entire life cycle of a product and how you can kind of ensure that the work going forward is building off of that foundation that you've hopefully equipped them with. Can you talk about how that went on HRC? Go ahead.
Yeah, and it takes shape differently, at different companies and on different projects with different, client teams. But I think one of the best opportunities that project managers, specifically in my context, have is when we are toward the late stages of, say, a traditional website redesign project. We're likely going to be conducting a set of trainings with internal stakeholders at the client team. So on HRC, we were meeting with folks across the organization who touch the site, who put out press releases, who create new resources in their resource library. I think that was a really great point to, for some folks, remind them about the best practices around entering content in a way that facilitates accessibility. And I can talk a little bit specifically about what that means. And then for some folks, it was novel information to be thinking about things like, making sure that when you link text inside of a page, that the link itself is meaningful. That if I were just scrolling through a list of the links on the page, that the text of that link would give me a rough sense in its context of where this is going. So avoiding things like having 16 buttons on a page that says view all and no sense of what view all really means or where it goes. So yeah, just thinking about avoiding things like click here or highlighting the word here as a link. Because if I'm a screen reader user and say I'm using a refreshable Braille display, and I'm going through a list of links on my Braille display, and all I hear is here, 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 I have no information really about where that content's going to take me. So, that discussions around alt text, making it a standard practice as users are entering image content into the CMS for them to add alternative text. Yes, Randy, that's a great example. Do this, like do what? What does this do? And you can think about that as like, it's funny to a certain extent because, it may be novel information to think about links in that way, but also it can be really concerning as a user if you don't know where a link is going to take you. It's like when you get a text message and you have no idea what this link includes from this random spam stranger. It's concerning not to have a sense for where you're going to be taken on the web. So those are a couple of good examples. I think the other thing is if you touch a WYSIWYG editor, just sort of the standard text editor on most websites, is making sure that you are really using the heading settings that they allow inside that editor to, when you have a second level heading and then that heading has a subheading, making sure that you're actually setting that as a heading level 2 and then a heading level 3 nested beneath it, because that structure is meaningful. Trying to avoid, if you are on this call and you are guilty of using bold to set up headlines on your web pages instead of using headings, that would be the one takeaway I hope that you take away is using real headings and not bolded text for subheads. So circle back to the original question. I think one of the coolest opportunities for project managers, account managers, whoever's leading some trainings for an internal team is going back to those fundamentals of creating accessible text and image content. And that's what outlives code changes on a site. That's what's going to be living on the site and being updated on the site in perpetuity, or in the app if that's your context.
Yeah, no, that is awesome. And I'm also kind of curious, did you have some interactions with the HRC team and kind of transferring that to them? Were they already kind of ready to hit the ground running? How would you approach kind of if you did need to kind of do a little training or just kind of making sure that folks on the client side are equipped to do all that? Is it telling them all that stuff? Anything else that you would kind of recommend there?
Yeah, I think in the specific case with HRC as sort of a grounding example, it was a combination of those trainings, which are face-to-face or in this context on Zoom. And then there was some custom documentation that I and some members of the team wrote up together as part of a larger set of documentation around how to use their new site. And then also just, like I said, even when you're working with clients, sharing the resources that are out in the ether that help people do this work better. You don't have to reinvent the wheel or rewrite the article that already exists. It's linking out to things like WebAIM, webaim.org. That is an organization based out of Utah State University, led by a man named Jared Smith. He's brilliant. And they have a really great library of resources around how to code and enter accessible content. So I think I sent a lot of WebAIM links as well as direct one-on-one training.
Yeah, I love that kind of it feels like the running thread throughout this conversation, Peyton, is that you kind of take this approach of empowering people, giving them the stuff that they can just make the decision that they want to make, that they would make if they just had some information and had some of the tools. I think that that is such a wise and mature approach to, I think, what is often the default, which is, I mean, I think I would do this, which is just, I need you to do things this way. Like, this is important. You need to do things this way.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I'm continuing to learn and recognize as an opportunity for myself is that really early on, I really was tempted to be the one and be the one doing the thing, but that's not sustainable. It's not a way that empowers people or organizations. You know, it's much more impactful for me to flag to an individual to say, hey, this I saw this issue in the content. It's really quick to fix. Here's a video screen recording of how I did that, versus just like being sort of like heads down. I'm just going to go in and fix the heading and move on with my life. I think I was definitely susceptible to that trap, quote unquote, early on. But we're really talking about a time frame of maybe 2 or 3 years. So I'm realistic about where I am in this journey.
Yeah, no, I think that I think that it's important though, even if we were to kind of talk about that real quick of, I think you and I are both in the same boat of not necessarily being, you know, early career, but not necessarily not being seasoned. Definitely not at that point yet. But I think that one thing that I've loved kind of seeing in you is you fairly early on were like, this is what I want to focus my energy on. I'm going to do this. And I think that that kind of focus and finding something that you're really passionate about, finding this one way that you can make a great impact with your work. I think that's something that sometimes early career folks do struggle with. I've struggled with that. And I wonder if we can quickly kind of just talk about that, and any advice that you would have for folks who are bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, want to make a difference, but there's so much out there. Yeah, how do you choose? How do you chase that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm probably a terrible person to ask this question to. Like, I really am that sort of like, I'm just so curious. I have a journalism degree. Like, what I eat up about, you know, getting to work at an agency like Viget is the real diversity of clients and industries and focuses. You know, for a 6-month period, I might be really focused on COVID-19 testing, and then the next 6 months, I might be focused again on LGBTQ rights. Like, that sort of diversity is really interesting and energizing to me. I think I can't tell you how to find the exact thing that you're really interested in, but I think it was really evident to me early on, like just how energized I was in engaging in conversations around accessibility and getting into, I think fights is not the right word, but back and forth with disagreements with coworkers around the right way to go forward with things was really stimulating and a really cool both thought and practical exercise. Debates is a great word. Thank you, Randy.
Good, yeah.
So I would say what I have tried to challenge myself to do over the last couple of years is to yes, continue the sort of like broad curiosity foundation of my career path, but to really say like, okay, I'm going to really focus on accessibility for the next few years at a minimum. I'm going to get access to the courses and the certifications that I need to feel like I've really created more of a T-shaped skill set, and accessibility being that dip. So I think it's a little bit of discipline, but I really think going back to the beginning, I'm like probably not the best person to talk to you about this. I'm just like insatiably curious about a bunch of different things. So yeah, I'll stop there.
No, but I think that that's very real though. I think of a lot of folks who are kind of entering this realm and like, whoa, I could do so much. I could do all these things and I'm interested in all these things. And I think that even that kind of, even thinking about it like, this is something that I'm willing to debate someone over, that I want to kind of get into a debate, that I care that much and I want to have feelings kind of about this, is maybe a good kind of litmus test for folks, and knowing that it's okay to be curious and it's okay to go around and learn about all the things. But if you find something, yeah, exercise a little bit of that discipline and try to go deep.
And I would say the next thing is talk to your mentors. whether it's mentors in the specific content area, but also, your manager. I'm lucky to be supported by a really great manager who has been like finding opportunities for me to, exercise these skills and also find, training resources and things. So I think whether it's within your management structure or, someone that you just respect from a project that you've worked on is leaning on those folks too, because and like especially like at Viget, there are a couple really strong accessibility leaders on the front end development team. So leaning into their knowledge, setting up coffee chats about that sort of thing is has been really helpful to me.
Yeah, no, that's awesome advice. I know that, so we have about 20 minutes left, and I think I actually want to, if it's okay with you, Peyton, start looking at the questions in chat and just see if we can get through those. I feel like we're always kind of struggling to get through them in these. So, yeah, if it's okay, I'm going to just read them off, and then Peyton can respond, and then we're going to start with William. But William, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to unmute, jump in. But yeah, William says that I'd love to hear about your experiences of how and where you integrate accessibility requirements in your project management.
Yeah, so as a project manager at Viget, I really do alongside my other Viget PMs, who's many of whom are on this call. You get to see the full life cycle of a project, all the way from the very beginning, discussions around the scope of the project through actually executing on that work and getting it out the door. So I'd say at the very beginning, it's making sure that playing an active role in the discussion around what the client's expectations are for accessibility. And that both means like evaluating and understanding where they are in terms of understanding accessibility, and then also pointing to guidelines to say, okay, for this new app, sorry, I think someone might have unmuted.
That was me.
Oh, cool.
That was William who unmuted.
Yeah.
Because I appreciate what you're saying, and so this is good to hear. I'm talking sort of about like at the user story level, the acceptance criteria, epic, feature, how you tell, okay, this is the scope of the project. All right, so these are the accessibility impacts. We're going to put them here at this part of our process. Like, I'm interested in like your experiences and challenges there.
Yeah, so I think as a project manager, my goal is to avoid that sort of chunked thinking as much as possible within the realistic constraints of a project. But I'm thinking about in design reviews, in that contracting discussion, in just writing out user stories and specific feature front end tickets, making sure that folks are aware of the standard that we're trying to meet in this piece, and that when I go into myself perform QA testing or collaborate with another tester, that those are standards that we're going to be using as acceptance criteria. So making really clear up front that yes, okay, we've got a form coming up. We're putting in an RFQ form. That form needs to meet the accessibility standards that we understand. Let me know if you have questions about what that means, or lean on your team for that. So yes, I think it's part of the user stories, but I think it's generally inserting the priority of accessibility along the way. And then where I'd say it comes in most often in projects as like a dedicated focus or something where you're going to see tickets that specifically say like accessibility, is in quality assurance testing, when we're going through to see if things meet those acceptance criteria, and then flagging specific barriers. But I would say trying to avoid saying like, okay, we're going to do like an accessibility sprint in the middle of this project, or if this isn't a project, we're working on a product that exists into perpetuity. Okay, for March and April, we're going to be running 6, maybe 4 accessibility sprints, trying to avoid those thoughts and thinking that in each sprint, as part of the acceptance criteria for the work that you're doing, accessibility isn't a prerequisite for acceptance. And the exceptions to that rule should be pretty minimal. I would say that usually it fixes, as long as you've thought about accessibility in design reviews and you're asking front-end developers or your engineering team to be asking those sorts of questions in handoff meetings or design reviews. Hopefully you're getting down to really like the brass tacks, the very, very specific remediations.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question, William. And yeah, moving on. And yeah, Carl brought up a good point, which is John. I think John is here. I'm not sure, but John is definitely a resident expert on accessibility, and I think he put his Twitter handle into the chat. So definitely hit him up as well. He's an awesome awesome resource to lean on. But Randy, yeah, I think you had a great question about.
I could say William's also a great expert too. This is John.
we have a meeting full of experts.
Yeah, but you're funnier than me, so it's always
Well,
different.
we are Laurel and Hardy. Let's go on.
Anyway.
Oh no, that is excellent. Yeah, thanks to both of you. But yeah, Randy, you were talking about creative thinking methods that supplement gaps between that kind of binary thinking and learning suggesting options. That's a great question. Yeah, Peyton, what would you say to that?
That is a really great question. So I think there are some ways that folks in the industry have attempted to fill some gaps. You hear often around things like empathy testing or empathy exercises. I think the current understanding specifically around folks with disabilities who are doing accessibility work is that those tend to have sort of inherent promises, like trying on a disability is really not an appropriate way to go about filling in some of these gaps. So I think some of the ways that you can fill in gaps is user testing. And not only asking a user of a screen reader to say, like, is the screen reader accessible? That's a question that hopefully you should be able to lean on standards to answer to a reasonable level, but asking a screen reader user, hey, can you check out with X, Y, and Z in your cart? And then tell me about that experience. So I think one of the best ways, and it's not really creative thinking, but it is a research method, is engaging with users with disabilities in user research. And there are a bunch of ways that you could go about recruiting for that if you have extra questions about that. I think nothing else like really groundbreaking is coming to mind there. I would say, yeah, avoiding empathy exercises as like a sort of try on disability. It's not really an effective way to go about things. If we think about the specific case of doing quality assurance testing with NVDA. NVDA is an open source free screen reader for Windows computers. And if I'm testing on NVDA, I'm going to be looking at the page to ensure that the page matches, the screen reader output matches what I'm expecting to receive in terms of content on the page. I'm not attempting to like simulate the experience of being a low vision user going through this piece. I'd say that's actually a good gap. The one perhaps caveat to that is there are really great rendering tools in browsers like Chrome. Chrome offers some rendering tools to filter a page through several different color deficiencies in vision. So having a better sense for, if you're not colorblind, what a colorblind user might see from a page, what someone with consistently blurred vision might see from the page, and then someone with who doesn't see color or sees things in grayscale might experience content. So
I'm Peyton. Could I just kind of interrupt and have a comment? I guess what I was kind of looking for is, kind of like I hear your concern, that tension between, you've been there, you've built stuff. Anybody who's built stuff, wrote code, they have that little instinct of once they're in a problem discussion setting, they're jumping to a solution, either a solution candidate or solution option.
Yeah.
And I guess, but that doesn't always necessarily, again, there's maybe, you go from binary being it's either this or that to basically, well, is there a C we don't know about?
Yeah.
And I guess that was kind of what I was really kind of at least asking towards. And I think it's, and I think, in addition, I think through my short user experience education is I found that extreme cases have usually pushed those standard design practices further. They either said, well, this doesn't apply. Like when you go from laptop to mobile, rule of thumb is the person viewing the mobile gets about 50% of what's on the laptop. But we didn't know that until we actually tested it. So I appreciate let's get with the user. But again, I think as we go to extreme interactions, that forces us into saying, hey, let's build these new rules of thumb, or at least discover them. I think, and I think the one case that, I haven't necessarily totally wrapped my mind around is accessibility and things like assisted reality, virtual reality. There are discussions around that, which most people can think, wow, is there accessibility in those? And there are.
Yeah, definitely.
And really, so it was more of a discussion, but that was kind of my mindset, is that, can we inject creative type methods into building those new rules of thumb, or at least fine tuning what we had with previous media? It's not just the ability of the user, it's the media and the richness and the, whatever, the different attributes of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a really good point too. I think I would point back to the original point around user research. There is making sure there are a lot of folks. I mentioned being a non-disabled person doing accessibility work. There are a lot of non-disabled folks sort of venturing into the accessibility space as entrepreneurs. I think it's really important to think about, as you are considering collaborating with a team to create a new product, whether it be in the built environment or digitally, that you're really engaging with the community that you're trying to serve. And when I say engaging with them, also like hire them, make sure that they're part of teams or in positions of leadership on your your industrial design team, so that you're creating solutions that folks actually need in those more novel spaces. The AR VR thing made me think very specifically, if you're interested in sort of injecting accessibility content into your content diet, Ally Weekly, A11Y, which is a shorthand for accessibility, A11Y Weekly, is a really great newsletter that comes out on Monday. And I think that he included some pieces around AR VR in the last month or two, if you dig through the archives.
Yeah, that was a great discussion point, Randy. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, Lauren. Lauren, I had the question about getting other teams excited about accessibility work, particularly at the onset of a project when the work required can feel a bit overwhelming. Yeah, great question, Peyton. What do you think?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think that it's much easier to prevent challenges than remediate them. So I think it can be energizing to a team to think about how we can do things quote unquote right, or with equity as a central intention from the start, so that we don't have to come back and fix this later. I think less bug tickets is a nice sell for some members of the team. That's cool. I think one of the best ways to get folks thinking and excited about accessibility is to talk about accessibility, to make sure that, if you start internally with maybe like a project kickoff meeting, making a point to make sure that accessibility is mentioned in that thing. So you're setting a sort of a value around accessibility from the very start, and that folks see from the start that, oh yeah, as we go through this project, like I'm going to get asked about accessibility, so I should really be thinking about it in X, Y, or Z way. I think, sorry, I jumped to legal departments. I'm curious to talk about that one too. Particularly, yeah, I think making sure that folks know that if you are going to be the sort of core accessibility advocate on the team, that they know what to expect from feedback there, and really opening up that, when I share a bug around accessibility, like, it is open for discussion. Like, let's make sure that we have a healthy sort of culture of candor on our team around disagreeing with each other, because I think that's important too. It doesn't always work out exactly perfectly that way, but it's a good intention to set in the very start. And Elise, I do want to save like 2 to 3 minutes just to talk about a couple like quick take accessibility practices, for folks who might want to take something tangible.
Please, yes, I think that'd be awesome. Maybe, do you want to do a quick, it looked like we had kind of a bundled question, Carl and Allison. You want to tackle that real quick and then wrap up with your takeaways?
Yeah. So Allison's question was around, it's in the chat, to build on Carl's question. Allison is also curious if we found that selling the business case for accessibility to be more or less compelling than focusing on equity as sort of the driving ethos And if we use both, how do you think about that balance? Definitely think about both. So this sort of ties back to Carl's question too. It's important for organizations to recognize that the legal landscape around accessibility in the United States is complex, but I think the main takeaway is that if you are a company and you have a website, that website should be accessible. And WCAG 2.1 level AA is the best standard to hold yourself to prevent legal challenges down the road. So when I say legal challenges, what I'm saying is Americans executing their right to make civil rights claims when they believe that their civil right to access has been violated under either the Americans with Disabilities Act or Section 508 of the, it's a procurement law within the federal government that says that if the federal government buys software or engages with a software company, that software needs to be reasonably accessible.
Rehabilitation Act.
Thank you. And it's from, I think, the 70s, but it has been updated.
73.
Yeah, so it's been updated.
On it.
He is on it, thank you. So I would say it's important to know that if you engage with the federal government or if you are a company that has a digital property, your best way to prevent yourself from denying your users their civil rights to access is to lean on the international standards. There are a bunch of nuances in there. Many of the cases that relate to ADA coverage they play out in circuit courts around the United States. And so the level to which the precedent that they set impacts other courts is really determined on the circuit. So it's really specific there. I'm actually really interested in this, so I'll share it. So under the ADA, there are 3 different opinions in different circuits around the country. Multiple circuits sometimes share sort of an agreement about how they handle cases. Some say that websites are not included under the ADA. They're not a public place of accommodation, which is the sort of text of the law. Some say that if you are a company that has a physical location and also a website, that physical location meets the sort of brick and mortar standard of the law, and you do need to make your website accessible. And then some people say that a website is, by the text of the law, a place of public accommodation and therefore needs to be accessible. So the legal landscape is changing a lot at the federal level. There are also laws in California and New York that also play into this space as folks attempt to, seek redress for violations of their civil rights. I would say that legal case is a compelling case to folks, but I don't think that it's I think it's a shaky foundation for building a culture of accessibility inside of an organization. So maybe, yes, it's compelling for your SVP of finance and your general counsel or your legal staff. But the true foundation around accessibility and building a culture at a company is going to be in thinking about access as sort of a core piece. And also, roughly 20% of the world's population has some sort of disability. So there is a large market of users with disabilities that organizations gain access to by having accessible content. Another Viget colleague recently posted an article about the business case for accessibility on viget.com, so you can check that out. She has some really great thoughts.
Yeah. We'll do our best to gather some of these resources, but because those are awesome questions. And I do want to say, well, you have 1 minute, Peyton. I'm so sorry. Or for anyone who can stay a little bit longer. But yes, Peyton, go for it. Takeaways.
I can do this. 30 seconds. If you touch web or socials, the 2 things that I would love for you to take away are alternative text. If you're providing images or videos, that you are providing alt text that describes the content of those images, if those images provide meaningful content. If it's just like a graphic of stars or something, you don't really need to describe that. You can do that on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and the UI for completing those tasks is pretty straightforward. I'm happy to show you that myself, or you can just Google how to add alt text on those social platforms. If you are a frequent user of hashtags on your company socials, ensuring that you are capitalizing the first letter of each word in a hashtag is really important, so that the screen reader knows to read those out as different words. and making sure that if you're ever working on a digital property that you're using your keyboard to at least test tabbing through the page, see if you can do what you need to do with your tab key, your space bar, and your arrows. I think that the web would be a much better place if folks at least just took those 3 steps.
Awesome. Well, you did it, Peyton. That's exactly 1 o'clock. Thank you everyone for coming. These were awesome questions. I'm so glad we got to cover them, hopefully got to all of them. But Peyton, thank you for your time. And yeah, thanks to all of you. I'll send a follow-up email about some of this stuff and ways to get in touch with Peyton if you have more questions. But yeah, thank you everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Bye.
You go get them.